Everybody, welcome to our lecture on chapter 1. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. It looks like you can see everything I can see, so we'll keep going. But this is our first chapter in the interpersonal communication book. We actually the authors start us talking with some general ideas or topics around communication. And I want to point out this introduction to human communication because over the years, some students have asked me, hey, does this apply to pets? I haven't studied pets and I'm not an expert in their communication, but I would think some of it applies. I know that with my pets, I have cats, I try to use things like tone and volume and even rate to enforce my messages, and they seem to respond better. So I'll point out those instances when I think it applies to animals, but just in case you're wondering, most of our conversation is going to focus on people. So yay, since most of us are going to spend our time in that place. So the things that I'm going to talk about in this lecture, again, we'll do an overview of interpersonal communication, talk about some basic principles of human communication. I'll introduce the topic called communication competence for those who are not familiar with that. And then we'll also talk about types of communication. And I also want to tell you that the way that this book is laid out, each of the first few chapters repeat a lot of the content. So in this chapter, we won't go into a significant amount of detail because it is meant to just be a quick overview. Whereas in each of the next couple chapters, you'll get more details as we go. Alrighty, so one of the definitions that our book presents us with is Bachner's definition from 1989 of interpersonal communication. And I'm going to apologize right now because I mentioned I have cats, and every time I'm on camera, one or more of them like to come into the office and co-host with me. So my little cat Addie is over here making noise in the closet. And I know what you're thinking, just close the door and then she won't interrupt you. No, that's not an option. They'll bang on the door until I open it. So this is the lesser of two evils. Hopefully you can't see her or hear her, but just know that could be coming at any moment. There could be a cat in the shot. So sorry. Interpersonal communication is when we have two communicators. Here on the slide, you see it says at least two, but that's according to our book, but I'm going to suggest you keep your mind to just two. Inter is, we think of the prefix as meaning like between. So like between two people. Any more than two, you'll see in a little bit, we get into something else. So we're looking at communication that happens between two people who are intentionally orienting or connecting with one another. It says it's both subject and object. And all that means is that we're always sending and receiving messages. And then it says whose actions embody each other's perspective, both toward the self and toward the other. Again, as we talk more about the communication process, we'll talk about what that means. But essentially, think of this as at least two people who are interdependent or connected with one another, and then their communication shapes that connection over time. So that's our interpersonal communication definition. We will talk a good amount about the communication process, but as you can see here, it's a process by which people share ideas or information with others. And some of you who've had classes with me before already know the answer to the question I'm going to ask, but not everybody's taken a class. So I will ask, if you, out of 100%, what percentage of communication do you think comes from verbal communication, which are the words we use? Just a quick guess. Okay, maybe you paused it, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you 7% of our communication comes from verbal communication. 93%, which is the rest of 100, comes from our nonverbal communication, which is our tone, our volume, our movement, our gestures. We'll talk more about each of these as we move on, but that's a really significant difference, I think. And if you look at the diagram that you see here, this is a transactional model of communication, which again, we talk more about in the next chapter, but it's very involved and very dynamic, meaning it is always changing. And so on each side of this process, you can see kind of the outline of two faces. Again, that would be interpersonal. This is a good illustration of interpersonal communication. Two people having a conversation, and we're referring to both of them as communicators. And that's because we always are sending and receiving messages. through verbal and nonverbal communication. You'll see a reference here to something called noise, which we talk about more, again, I believe chapter 2 and 3. But essentially noises are the things like I just talked about with my cat, Addie. In this example, she's making what we call physical noise. Maybe we planned that. Maybe she knew what I was going to talk about. She's making physical noise. Oh, here she comes. Which then, as you can see, it's interrupting my message because now I'm thinking about her. And if she's changing my thoughts about, instead of focusing just on this lecture, I'm thinking, at what moment is she going to jump up here? Then that would be psychological noise. And we'll talk more about the different types of noise. But for now, I want to introduce you to the transactional model of communication. And then we will go to something called symbols. Most of you are already familiar with symbols. They represent a mark, an object, or a sign that represents something else. One example could be a stop sign. Most of us know that when you see, what is it, an octagon? I don't know, I think it's an octagon. A stop sign with red background and white lettering, it says stop. But even if we took the word stop off of the sign, most of us would know it meant stop. In my class currently this semester, but a couple of weeks ago, I had a student say, I was in Mexico and the sign said alto, and I didn't put it together that it was a stop sign. So I just kept going, even though the student speaks Spanish, he just didn't connect the dots. But most of the time we do understand the same symbols. The fact that we don't always understand the same symbols is what reinforces to us that symbols are more so in the meanings people ascribe to them than in the symbol itself. And the stop sign is a great example. Most of us might know it means stop, but maybe not everybody in all instances. And so what that does is it reminds us that, with our communication, we want to be clear anytime we're using symbols and consider our audience to make sure it makes sense to them. If you look at these, you have several emojis that you can see here on the slides. Some of these emojis represent universal gestures or facial expressions that are recognized universally around the world. For example, a smile is I think the most recognized gesture, but some of these others, maybe they're unclear. If you were to get them by text, I'm trying to think of the one with like a straight line. It's like, I don't know, I always misunderstand that. Like, does that mean somebody's like mad, or does it mean they don't know what they want to say? The meanings are in the people more so than the symbols. And I also want to touch on what it says here about intentional and unintentional communication. If we are experienced communicators, we're probably spending time thinking about our messages. Like I always prepare before I do these lectures. I've been teaching the same content for a lot of years, but I still think through what words I want to use. I also think through making sure my lighting is good, making sure my volume is good, things like that. But those are all intentional messages. I'm putting thought into them. But it could be that there's some unintentional things that are coming through also. Maybe I rushed through something and you're like yelling at the screen, like, Carol, wait, I don't even know what you just said, and you kept going. Maybe I unintentionally suggested something is more simple than it is. So we always want to be mindful of the messages that we're sending, because even if they're unintentional, they can still communicate something. I also want to point out another bit of noise that's happening in this moment while I'm recording. There is a tremendous amount of wind going on outside my window, and my creating these videos was postponed a little bit because my power was out because of all this heavy wind and rain is coming. So should this video cut out in the middle, I will create another shorter piece to finish it out. I should say this or any of my other videos that you see, because I'm trying to record them all in a couple of days, but just heads up on that. It's not because I just don't know how to use my monitor or my computer. Speaking of which, let's talk about competent communication. You've probably heard or been familiar with the term competent in the workplace. If I say, oh, well, she's a competent barista, that means we can trust her to do a really great job. She's going to get the order right. She's probably going to be efficient at making the order. And ideally, in a competent barista, we also want somebody who's friendly. If we think about competency in terms of communication, we also want to think about whether or not that person has done a good job of being appropriate and also effective. Appropriate is that, as you can see on the screen here, what most people would consider as acceptable. Meaning if you were in my in-person class right now, we would stay away from curse words. I just had this conversation with my class a couple of weeks ago, not because I think college students have never heard them before, but because I always appreciate or approach, I should say, my classes as though it was similar to a workplace, and that yes, we want to have fun and connect and tell good stories, but also we want to mimic what would be appropriate for the workplace. So we change our language and maybe some of our nonverbals a little bit. And to be competent, we're just always mindful of, is this, you wouldn't tell a really inappropriate joke to most grandparents. Some grandparents you would, but you would think about your audience before telling the joke is the point. And then the second element of competence, according to our authors of our textbook, would be is if your messages are effective. That is really, I usually write this on the board. If the way to know if your messages have been effective is that the message you send is equal to the message that's received. So if I'm trying to make you upset about something and at the end of our conversation, that's what happens, then I was effective. We can argue whether or not that's ethical. But if I'm trying to have a conversation with you where our relationship grows and you walk away upset with me, I probably have not been very effective. So that tells me there's opportunity for me to think about my communication if I want a better relationship with somebody, because that's within my control, is my own communication. And just so you know, we only have a couple more slides left, so good job keeping up. This is a visual taken from our textbook, and I usually draw it the other way on the board, but I'm going to explain why it looks like this here. So with each of these levels, if we start at the top, you can think about them being the smaller number of people, meaning there are fewer people at the top of this pyramid. And as we go down, as the pyramid gets bigger, we can think about it like there's more space, so that leaves space for more people. The first level of communication is intrapersonal. That means you communicating with yourself. We have a whole chapter on this, so I'll talk more about it. But everything you're doing, everything you're thinking or believe to be true, or your state of mind, everything you're going through comes out in your communication in the next level. With people at the interpersonal level, it just does. And so if you are not in a great state of mind, it's likely your communication with other people is going to reflect that. And that second level, like we said, is interpersonal communication. That's when there's two of you involved. When you start including more people, around 3, I have to do 3 this way, because when I try to do 3 this way, you can see my finger this one doesn't come all the way up. So now I do 3 this way. When you have 3 to 5 people, that's small group communication. Public communication, in this class, you won't be doing any speeches, but I may have you, I think this class does have you submit some video assignments just for practice of communication online. But public communication is typically one to many. So if I were in a physical classroom, I would be public speaking. And then mediated communication is what I'm doing now. It's technically one to infinite amount of people, because anybody could watch this. It could be streamed. It's not going to be streamed, for funsies, but it could be. And so this is mediated communication. And the thing to know, the reason why we talk about these levels is because each level you go to where there are more people included, there are more opportunities for miscommunication. And so it's the more people involved, we really need to be more careful about our communication, both our verbal and our nonverbal communication. Oh, this was the last one, so you're welcome. So the things that we talked about today for this chapter, I should say, would be, again, an overview of interpersonal communication, which is 2 people interacting with one another. We talked about the basic principles of communication, which were in that transactional model slide that I showed you. We talked about communication competence, which is when you are both appropriate and effective. And then we also talked about the different types of communication. Really, it's more like the levels of communication. I hope that you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know.